Art is held, in the dulled hands of humanity, as something priceless. Its worth exists in a constant whir of opinion, coupled together by the feelings of those who turn their eyes to it. Real art, the world would argue, is raw. It has power beyond its existence, has the ability to reach out from beyond the press of glass and frame, to grab at parts of ourselves that we keep locked up, to feed the things we have no choice but to starve. The naked things, the disfigured things. Art, when allowed to be real, is given domain over us, given the ability to change the way we survive. Sometimes it is hard to tell the difference between the choices we make for ourselves and the choices that art makes for us. Sometimes I wonder if there really is a difference between the two at all. I don't know the limits of art, if there are any limits to what it can achieve, what it can prompt. All I know is that, at the heart of the misfortune I suffered as a child, there was one piece of artwork in particular. Artwork in the traditional sense of the word. A painting. The painting was a gift. Or it wasn't. It had been a part of the house long before we lived there, or it had been something we'd brought along with us. It was placed on the wall at the top of the stairs, against the greying wallpaper. It had been clothed with a gilded frame, bathed in the thin, yellow light carved into the ceiling above. What was the painting of? Well, it was of something grotesquely beautiful. Something uncomfortable. Its proportions uncertain and jagged. Something unknown but recognizable. Something with a great deal of bright, blank colour. It was truly a piece of art. Priceless when you looked at it, nothing when you looked away. My own mother detested it at first. She begged my father to take it down, said that it made her feel sick, unsafe. My father refused, a little guiltily, a little gleefully, because it scared her, terrified her. That painting. And there was a part of him that wanted her to be afraid. Just a little afraid. It kept her quieter, kept her from meandering out of line. He didn't even have to raise her hand. He let the painting hang itself at the top of the stairs, even though he despised it just as much. I was only young then, no more than 6. And yet, I knew that much. I'd catch him sometimes, standing at the top of the stairs, glaring up at the canvas, mouth working silently around mute words, perverse, abhorrent, pulling at the corner of his mouth, making the muscle twitch and bounce beneath the wrinkled skin. I even had the suspicion that he hated it more than my mother. I don't remember what I thought of the painting in the beginning. I knew it was something more than it was, but it didn't quite hold me prisoner in the same way it did my parents. I think I, mostly, avoided it. And it was happy to let me slip by, small and unfocused, for a while. Until a few years had passed, and the painting's grip grew stronger. My parents' marriage was decaying, collapsing from the inside out. It had been a tremulous structure to begin with, their relationship. A thing built on the thin, deformed legs of fear and necessity. My father was a large, irritable man, with no real talent, but enough brain to know he needed a stable flow of money. My mother was a small, needling woman, with a great bundle of ability, but an inability to do anything alone. I was the poor, pale nail that held the whole sham together. And as I grew, the hole I'd been hammering into began to strain and splinter around me. The marriage was going to burst, was going to tear itself. It would have been easier if they'd divorced, if they'd given up and let me flounder in the sudden sea of change their parting would have ushered in. Instead, I was stuck in no man's land, watching them pelt each other again and again with a rapid shower of insults and threats that quickly escalated to petty, cruel blinks of violence. There was no shelter for me in their war. The arguments they used to have were so common and so inane that they blurred together now. There is no particular argument that stands out, except for one. Their last one. The one that started over a discrepancy in my mother's shift timetable and ended with a sudden, whispered threat. "That painting has to go," she seethed, hands slammed down on the dinner table. I forked at my pasta, cold on my plate, watching her with wide, quiet eyes. "I won't look at it any longer, John. I won't. It has to go." My father stared back at her, tiny eyes blinking fast behind his spectacles. He'd fallen quiet in his confusion, left without words for the first time in a long time. "The painting on the stairs?" he asked, incredulous. My mother nodded harshly, not quite willing to raise her eyes to his. "I hate it. You know I hate it." "It's been there for years," my father bristled, thrown to his feet in his own spell of exasperation. "You don't mind it anymore." "I do," my mother dared. "I do mind it. You tricked me, told me it would be fine. But it's not fine, it's—" Their voices were only rising, and neither registered when I slipped off my chair and scampered up the stairs to my bedroom. When passing the painting, I remember trying hard not to look at it, suddenly aware of its size, its weight. It looked too big to be on the wall, too heavy. It would fall down, I knew it, and if I was unlucky enough to be around when it happened, it would crush me. The next morning, when the sun came whittling through the gauzy glaze of clouds in the sky, it was as if the argument had never happened. The painting remained, and so did my parents, glancing bitterly at each other over breakfast. I rushed myself off down the hill to the school, leaving my parents alone in that house, together. They didn't argue about the painting again. Not because either had changed their minds. No, because sometime that afternoon, my father killed himself. My mother was out working when it happened, so I came home to see it, to see him, hanging at the top of the stairs. I stared and stared, unsure. I cried, perhaps, or I screamed. When I finally tore my eyes away and managed to blink, there were police there with me, gently holding my shoulders, assuring me that everything would be all right. Everything. Everything. The painting stared out from behind my father's back as he swung there, and I wondered why it had never truly scared me before. My mother was quiet after that. There was a funeral, a black-clad, stifling sort of affair. I carried on with life as deftly as I could, but there was something stunted in me. The world, which before had seemed so vast and interesting, was suddenly a lot more still. And the painting, I hated it. I would spit at it as I walked by, would glower and sneer, until it started to glower and sneer back. I could feel the heat pulsate off it as I walked by, could feel the warped horror of it against my skin when I passed it. I moved my room to the ground floor in the end, just so I wouldn't have to ever be within its reach. My mother's opinion, however, had undertaken a radical transformation. The painting had redeemed itself somehow in her eyes. It was a masterpiece, she told me, a priceless possession. It was around that time that one of the neighborhood boys came over to play. Most children on the street avoided me, as if death was contagious, as if the boy without a father would, if you looked at him too long, take your father too, and then the whole street would be fatherless. But this little boy was different. He was a few years younger than I was, shy and uncertain, always trembling and stuttering. His eyes were big and blue, mouth always quivering. He had a name that reminded me of my grandfather, but I don't remember it now. We played together in my room for a while, making up stories and slotting ourselves into new lives, forcing the air around us to become whatever we wanted it to be. Eventually, when we'd grown hungry enough, we ventured out into the kitchen for dinner. My mother was out at work, so we set about feeding ourselves, pulling pots and pans from the cupboard, bread and cheese from the pantry. "Is your mother always out?" the boy asked me after we fixed ourselves some horrifically mangled meal. We were sitting across from each other at the dinner table, hunched over large china plates. I swung my legs beneath me, shrugging. She has to work." There it was then. Death. My father. The blackened moment of my life I never spoke about. The thing that kept the others away from me. The boy only glanced at me, softly, curiously, like he couldn't quite comprehend it. With some clever, gentle prodding, he somehow managed to weasel his way into a conversation about my father. It was the first time I'd spoken about it. It came out in a stunted, stupid rush of words. How I'd known my parents were unhappy. How I knew that that fight was something different. It had been about the painting after all. "The painting?" the boy asked. I stilled, uneasy, set my food down. My brain broiled at the thought of it, but I showed it to him anyway. We stood at the top of the stairs, staring up at it. It was the first time in a long time that I dared to look it head on. There was a furious, uneasy pull growing inside my stomach. "It's just a painting," I tried, feebly, as I glanced over to the boy. The boy met my eye, grinning stupidly. I blinked, feeling unbalanced. Something about his smile didn't quite match the moment, the air. "It's just a painting, but they argued about it all the time," I continued. "You're joking," the boy accused, that grin still on his face. I shook my head, irritated. "My mother likes it now, though, if you can believe it." The boy's smile trembled and simmered away, skin blanching. His hands curled into small fists at his sides. "I think I'm going to go home," he whispered, dropping his gaze. I frowned. "But I need to go," he repeated, turning and tumbling back down the stairs. I followed him, calling out his name. Walt, or Whitney, or something similarly grey, but he was already putting on his coat, grabbing his shoes. I let him go, standing at the bottom of the stairs, watching his back out the front door until he completely disappeared. I told her when she came home that night. I hated it. The painting. I couldn't stand it. She had to take it away or I'd go crazy. My mother only stared, quiet and thin-lipped, until I'd finished my rant, finished my screaming. She sat me down, rubbed a hand on my back, told me I needed to calm down, needed to get some sleep, stop staying up so late. The painting was just a painting, she said, and she'd grown fond of it. It reminded her of my father. The anger only got worse. My mother and I hardly spoke. When we did, we fought. I stopped avoiding the painting, started to confront it. Soon, I couldn't tell who I was more angry with, my mother, or that hideous, disgusting mesh of a painting. I think, I told it one day, glaring up at it defiantly. I think it would be best if you both went. You and my mother. I can't stand either one of you. Something in that painting cracked. Then, move with a writhing, jerky elegance. I took a step back, watched as it stilled again. I rubbed my eyes, convinced I'd imagined it. It was ridiculous, the longer I thought about it, that I hated the painting. It was only a painting after all. I stormed back downstairs, shoulders hunched, retreated to my room. I curled up under the covers and waited for something. Something I knew was coming. Something I couldn't quite see, couldn't quite comprehend. I found her beneath a painting the next morning. Scarlet webbing from her upturned wrists. The blade was on the wood of the stairs beside her, glistening with rusted, ruby pearls. Her face was pulled into a soft grimace, a whisper of pain. I stared and stared. Once again, there were officers, policemen, telling me to come with them, that I was safe. The next month was a blur of police and suits, of tears and consolations and relatives I'd never met before. My aunt took care of me as things, beyond my control, were straightened out. I stayed with her in a little seaside house, far away from the town. My mother had a funeral too. I cried, then hugged her and told her goodbye. Wished she could listen, wondered if she would, hoped she couldn't. As I continued to tell her I knew it was my fault, that I was sorry. My aunt and her daughter took delicate care of me. I began to look at the world with newfound interest. I began to run again, began to play, befriend others. I ate more, talked more. I carried my grief with childish promise, with sudden clarity. The days I'd spent in my old home, with my mother and my father and that painting, it all seemed far down the tunnel, blurred and incomplete. I'd been so vague and stiff then. I never spoke of my time in that town, until the day came when I went to collect my things from the house. My aunt and cousin came along, holding my hands, sheltering me between them. But there was no need for any sort of comfort. The town, in which had been so stony and flat in my mind, was startlingly normal and bright. The house was less suffocating. My aunt carried out my things from my bedroom, whilst I showed my cousin around. It was only then that I remembered the painting, that I caught it looking at me from the corner of my eye. My legs churned to a stop. My cousin, following behind me, slowed, frowned. "What's wrong?" she asked. I kept my gaze focused on the ground, steered towards the stairs. I just had to look at it one more time, just once more. My cousin followed me up, side by side, step by step, until we were standing beneath it, that hulking, bubbling blister of a painting, the thing that I couldn't bring myself to hate any longer, couldn't trick myself into loving. "I used to hate it," I muttered, towing at the wood of the stairs beneath us. My cousin was silent beside me, tipping her head up to look at the painting. I had a flash of panic, worried she would run off like that boy did eons ago. But she just stared, lips pressed together in that tolerant, straightforward way of hers. "My mother hated it first," I explained. I still hadn't looked at it, hadn't dared. I slowly, surely, crept my eyes up to look at it. It looked back, grinning. It had missed me. It had been waiting. I shut my eyes back down. "My dad hated it too. We all hated it. Until we didn't. I don't know why. It was just a painting." There was a long silence. "What painting?" I stopped, peeked at my cousin, trying to understand what sort of joke she was starting. "The one in front of us," I insisted, unsure, afraid to look at it. I pointed at it though, pointing at the breathing swath of canvas on the wall. "That's not a painting," my cousin said, blunt, naively unbothered, vaguely confused. "Yes, it is," I argued, still behind on the joke. "No," she said. "No, that's just a mirror." And when I looked up, I saw it too. The flat patch of reflective glass, the gilded frame around it. I saw our pale faces in it, staring down at ourselves, our matching brown eyes, our open mouths. The hate evaporated into sudden, dizzy confusion. It had been there. I had just seen it. I couldn't have just imagined it. It wasn't possible, because I'd seen it. We'd all seen it. My mother, my father, me. My cousin tugged at my hand, gentle. "I think we should go." I nodded, stiffly, let her lead me back down the stairs, back out of the house. We sat on the doorstep, together, talking in the dry heat of the afternoon sun. Neither of us brought up what we'd seen, what had happened, whatever it was that had happened. Finally, my aunt emerged, smiling and asking if we were ready to go home. Home. We rode away in silence. My aunt asked me if I was all right, if I was hungry or thirsty, or wanted to see anyone before we left. I told her I was fine. I never went back to the town. I never saw it again. I grew up with my aunt, letting her rear me into something stabler, something closer to the line of normal. I let myself grow into something that could face the world without the apathy that had strung itself into the very air I'd breathed as a child. I let myself forget the memories of my parents, my poor parents, and what they'd done to themselves, to each other. But I have nightmares still of that painting. I could never see it, never remember what it looked like. I thought it to be best to put it out there, to tell the story as it happened, to see if it would make me feel better at all. It has certainly given me some clarity, some relief. Maybe, perhaps, there'll be a day where I can sleep without seeing it. But there is a deeper truth than that. I'm not just saying this to heal. I'm telling this because I don't want to forget. No matter how cruel and twisted the memories are, I don't want to wake up and find that I can't remember it at all, even if I want to. Because sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I wonder if there'll be a time where the memory will cease to exist. Just like the painting itself, that when I look for it, I'll find something else entirely. And maybe it always was.